Hello, and welcome back to The Wrinkle. Today I'd like to have a serious talk about long-term care. In a previous video about long-term care, I mentioned that it's important that we never make our family members promise that they will never ever put us in a home. And the reason we even needed to have a video about that was that that's a common thing that happens. Many of us feel that long-term care is a horrible place, a place we would never want to be. And so we will talk about it with our families and request that they never allow us to go and live there. The reality is, though, that if we develop a major neurocognitive disorder or dementia, currently about 70% of people who have that diagnosis will spend the later part of their lives, or the sort of final stage of their life, most likely in a long-term care home. So 70% will spend time in a long-term care home at the end of life. So it's just not realistic to say that there's zero chance that we will need a long-term care home, or zero possibility that we will move there. Now, despite that, I think it would be natural for somebody to say, well, what about all the horrible things that we hear that have happened in long-term care? And there are some horrible stories. There's no question. There are people who've passed away unnecessarily in long-term care. There have been criminals working in long-term care who have caused great harm to people, even lethal harm. And that's not right. And that is something that would make us afraid, because the people who live in long-term care in general are very vulnerable and very frail. And so I can't minimize those incidents, and I don't think anybody would. But how do I respond to that? If I'm advising that for some people long-term care is the best place to be, how would I respond to that, those awful stories? So first of all, let's take a look at what's actually happening in long-term care, and what are we expecting of long-term care? There are about 78,000 long-term care beds in Ontario. There's about 630 homes in Ontario. So that's a lot of people who are affected by the long-term care system. In long-term care homes, 90% of the people who live there have some form of cognitive impairment. 2/3 of the people who live in long-term care have dementia. And 1 in 3 of those living in long-term care actually meet criteria for severe major neurocognitive disorder, or severe dementia. 1 in 3 people are also what would be considered highly dependent, so needing a lot of help with some of the most basic kind of care in the long-term care home. So those are individuals with a very complex medical history and complex needs. But there are some positive things that have been happening in long-term care lately. For example, over the last 5 years, there's been less restraint use, 50% less restraint use, less psychiatric medication use. And most homes, when they have an inspection, they do very well. So 90% of homes actually pass their inspections and in fact do well on inspections. So despite the demands of caring for those who live in long-term care, most homes are meeting those challenges. And most of the people that I meet who work in long-term care, and that includes the frontline workers, in fact, it's almost exclusively frontline workers, they're very compassionate and very caring people, and they look after the people who live in long-term care as though they were members of family. So recognizing that if we have somebody in our lives who's living with dementia, there's a good chance that we will need to face that transition to long-term care. And there are some things we can do to help ease that transition. The first thing is to open your eyes to what long-term care looks like. And that's literally to physically go and look at homes. Do tours of homes. Many homes will allow tours that can happen spontaneously, and that can include seeing places where residents will live and eat and have recreation. So it's really important to go and see homes, and sometimes that will confirm some of the expectations, but it can also give some pleasant surprises. And part of going to tour the home means that you're planning in advance. It's very important to make a long-term care plan before one needs a long-term care bed. So I mentioned that there are almost 80,000 beds in Ontario in long-term care homes, but there are 4,000 people waiting for those long-term care beds. And many of those people need a bed right now. There's not a lot of capacity in our system. And planning ahead isn't going to prevent any kind of challenge, but generally people who plan ahead will have more choice and more control over which home that the person will go to and how that transition will happen. The third thing is that I would say be prepared to make the transition. Be prepared to go. A lot of what I talk about when I'm working with a family, with a member who's going into long-term care, is giving permission to make the transition. When a bed becomes available, it's always something that people will second guess. That's natural. We probably are hoping that we won't have to face that transition and that something else will happen. So I think when a bed comes up, many people will second guess, oh, we could hold on a bit longer, or maybe we could do something else, or maybe something else could happen and we don't need to take this bed. But chances are that when a bed is available, it is time to go. So be prepared to go and know that it's going to be very challenging emotionally and perhaps physically and spiritually. And there's no two ways about that. Transitions are hard. So I wanted to make this video because I heard from some of the viewers and some other people that I interact with that long-term care really is a very difficult transition, and that a large part of it is fueled by some of the things we see in the media about long-term care. And remember that that's a very small percentage of what happens in long-term care, and most of it happens because of individuals who are very aberrant and very unusual, and most people who work in long-term care are extremely caring and dedicated and really want the best for the people who are living in the homes. If you want to take action about long-term care, I think it's definitely a good idea to contact your member of provincial parliament. That can be done through the government websites. I'm also going to leave a link to the Ontario Long-Term Care Association, which was part of where I got some of my information for this video. They do have a link where you can write to your MPP through their website, which makes it a little bit easier. And I think that it's important to talk to government about this because government has so many competing priorities, and we are the voice of people who are in long-term care. We are the voice of frail seniors, and it's important for us to raise our voices because I think this affects all of us. So I hope this was helpful. As always, I'm very happy to hear from you and have a discussion. If you disagree with anything I've said, that's important for me to hear. Or if I have any of the facts wrong, I'd also like to hear from you. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on The Wrinkle.